Joaquin Salazar was 52 years old and had more miles on his back than many airplanes. He drove an old red Kenworth truck that had been his home, office and confidant for more than 2 decades. He lived alone in a small apartment in Hermosillo with faded walls and a framed photo of his daughter Jimena above the dining room table. His relationship with her had cooled after the divorce, and although they spoke occasionally, Joaquin felt he had lost much more than a marriage. His routine was simple: load, drive, unload. Entire days spent talking to himself, eating at gas stations, and sleeping with the murmur of the engine. Life didn't hurt, but it didn't excite him either. It was like driving in a straight line without knowing if he still had a destination. That morning, he left early for Chihuahua, with the sky clear and the radio whispering old norteño ballads. The heat wasn't yet oppressive, and the coffee in the thermos was just right. With his tanned arms resting on the steering wheel, he was driving along a lonely stretch of Highway 16 when something caught his attention. On the right, next to a rusty sign that barely revealed the word San Pedro, a man dressed in a white robe raised his hand. He didn't seem agitated or in a hurry. Rather, he remained calm, as if he already knew Joaquin was going to stop. And without understanding why, he braked. He rolled down the window, and before he could ask anything, the man said, "Wherever you're going, if you're willing to take me." It wasn't a plea or an order. It was a calm statement, like an invitation sealed with the eyes. Joaquin, confused, nodded. The man got in without any luggage, without any rush. He sat calmly in the passenger seat, folded his hands on his knees, and looked out the window as if he already knew the route. Joaquin didn't know what to say. For a few minutes he drove in silence, throwing quick glances out of the corner of his eye, trying to understand who this stranger was. He had a serene face, perhaps about 40 years old, a neatly trimmed beard, and an expression that didn't fit with the harshness of the desert. The strangest thing was the feeling he produced. Being next to him didn't unsettle him. On the contrary, it calmed him, as if his mere presence lowered the volume of the world. "Where are you going?" Joaquin finally asked. "Wherever you're going," the man replied without taking his eyes off the horizon. That's when something in Joaquin clicked. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't crazy. He was someone who belonged there. Have you ever felt like someone appeared in your life just when you needed them most? If this happened to you, subscribe to the channel right now so we can continue telling these stories. The kilometers passed, and the atmosphere inside the cabin seemed different. The heat was no longer as bothersome, the engine noise less aggressive. On the radio, the news reported chaos, protests, and accidents. But Joaquin turned the volume down. Without thinking, he felt strange, but not uncomfortable. At a gas station near Nacori Chico, they stopped to refuel. While Joaquin was filling up the tank, the man in white disappeared. He didn't see him enter the bathroom or approach anyone. He simply wasn't there. A slight unease rose in his chest, as if something important was missing. He thought maybe he had dreamed the whole thing until when he got back into the truck, he found him there, sitting exactly as before. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him with a slight smile. Joaquin didn't ask questions. He started the engine and continued driving, unaware that the real journey was just beginning. After several hours on the road, Joaquin's stomach was growling. He stopped in a small town where there was a simple dining room made of green tarps and mismatched plastic chairs. He ordered 2 plates of machaca with egg and flour tortillas. The woman serving, Doña Rosa, according to the sign, couldn't help but look at the white-clad companion with a certain mixture of curiosity and respect. "Are you a priest?" she asked as she poured the coffee. Joaquin was about to say no, but the man replied, "I'm just accompanying." He didn't explain further. Throughout the meal, Joaquin waited for him to tell him something, to break the silence with some strange story or an explanation. But no, he just ate slowly, as if savoring each bite like a gift, and when they finished, he nodded his thanks. Doña Rosa didn't charge for the meal. "Sometimes you feel you have to give without asking," she said. Joaquin didn't insist. He paid for the coffee, and they continued on their way. It didn't take long for them to come across their first unexpected detour. A few kilometers from town, on a sharp curve, a pickup truck was stopped with its lights flashing and its hood open. A young woman was crying desperately next to the vehicle, holding a child wrapped in a blanket. Joaquín hesitated to stop, but the man in white placed a gentle hand on his arm. "This is it," he said. Without thinking twice, they got out. The woman's name was Alma, and her son, Emiliano, had a high fever and was unresponsive. They were headed to a hospital in Delicias, but the pickup truck's engine had suddenly died. Joaquín took the child in his arms and put him in the truck without asking. The man in white sat with him in the back bunk, murmuring soft words while the little boy clung to his shirt as if finding comfort only in his presence. Joaquín drove urgently, but with a strange peace guiding his hands. The mother, sitting in the front seat, sobbed non-stop as she looked back, where the man in white held Emiliano as if he were her own son. As they drove, the boy's fever seemed to decrease. When they arrived at the hospital, a doctor rushed out with a stretcher. The mother hurriedly got out, but before handing him over, the boy opened his eyes, smiled slightly, and whispered, "Thank you." It was unclear to whom he was addressing. Joaquín looked in the back seat, but no one was there. The man in white had disappeared again. The doctors said it was a miracle they arrived in time, that a couple more minutes could have been fatal. Alma, through tears, hugged Joaquín and asked for his number, but he only replied, "It wasn't me." She didn't know how to explain it, or why she felt that moment would be etched in her soul forever. He returned to the truck with a heavy heart. He opened the driver's door, and when he turned to get in, there he was again, the man in white, calm, as if he hadn't moved. Joaquín didn't ask anything more. He simply started the engine and rejoined the road. They passed several towns without stopping. Evening fell, tinting the dry fields and distant mountains orange. At some point, Joaquín broke the silence. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He just extended his hand and pointed to an unmarked crossroads. "Over there," he said. Joaquín obeyed. They entered a dirt road that bordered a valley, with dead trees and scattered houses. Everything seemed abandoned until they saw an old man sitting on a rock, staring at the ground with his eyes lost in thought. Joaquín braked without anyone asking him to. The old man's clothes were dusty. He wore an old hat on his knees and had a scar on his right cheek. Noticing someone approaching, he looked up suspiciously. Joaquín got out of the truck and offered him water, but the man didn't react immediately. It was the man in white who came forward. He sat next to him without saying anything, just looking at him, as if he had known him forever. The old man began to talk to himself, as if someone had set him alight from within. "I've been looking for my son for 33 years. I left him at a bus station in Durango because I couldn't feed him. I told him I'd come back for him, but I never did. I've been to every town, every city. I don't know if he hates me or if he's forgotten me." His voice cracked. Joaquín felt a lump in his chest. He had never heard so much pain expressed with such little force. The man in white placed a hand on Joaquín's shoulder and said something Joaquín couldn't hear. The old man began to cry like a child. He cried for minutes on end, letting the earth drink his tears as well. Then he stood up with difficulty, as if a huge burden had been lifted from his back. He looked at Joaquín and asked if he could take him to an address he had written on a crumpled piece of paper. It was written in shaky handwriting, "Ernesto Gomez, 12th Street, Barrio El Rosario, Durango." Joaquín nodded. They climbed into the truck, and although there were now 3 of them in the cab, the silence didn't weigh heavily. It was a silence filled with purpose. The old man held the paper tightly, as if it held the last hope of his life, and in the gaze of his new companion, Joaquín thought he saw something resembling joy. They drove for hours along untraveled roads. The sun had set behind the mountains when they reached the El Rosario neighborhood. Joaquín moved slowly through the dusty streets, lit by intermittent streetlights. They stopped in front of a modest house with rusty bars and a tricycle leaning against the wall. The old man got out without speaking, his hands shaking and his gaze fixed on the door. He knocked twice. On the other side, a man in his 40s got out with a distrustful expression. Joaquín watched from the truck. The old man stammered, "I'm your dad." The man didn't react at first. He just stared at him, as if unsure whether to cry or scream. Then, his son stepped forward and hugged him without saying a word. They merged into a silence that spoke volumes. Joaquín felt something loosen in his chest. The man in white was no longer in his seat. Joaquín didn't wait for thanks. He circled the block and parked near a closed store. He closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by what he'd experienced. He felt a soft breeze enter through the window, and without looking, he knew his strange companion had returned. "How do you do that?" he asked, tired but not angry. "I'm just where I'm supposed to be," the man replied. That night they slept in the truck, one in the bunk and the other in the seat. Dawn found them moving, heading north. They didn't know exactly where, but they didn't need to. Somewhere along the way, they saw a small figure running through the bushes on the side of the road. It was a child, dirty, barefoot, with his face covered in dirt and fear in his eyes. Joaquín slammed on the brakes. This time he didn't need any signal. The boy tried to flee at first, but the man in white got out first, calmly kneeling some distance away and extending his hand. He said nothing, but his mere presence seemed to calm the little boy. After a few seconds of hesitation, the boy approached as if he already knew him. Joaquín got out next, opened a bottle of water and offered it to him. The boy drank it eagerly. His skin was sunburned and his lips chapped. Didn't say his name or where he came from, only repeating in a raspy voice, "I don't want to go back, I don't want to go back." In the truck, he curled up next to an old blanket Joaquín used in the winter and fell asleep almost instantly. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was as if his body had endured everything it could. The man in white looked at him tenderly. "There are places where you shouldn't return," he said softly, more to himself than to Joaquín. For the rest of the day, they searched nearby towns to see if anyone knew him, if there were any reports, if any mothers were looking for their son. Nothing, no one, just silence and evasive glances. A local police officer suggested they take him to a shelter in Parral, but when Joaquín mentioned this to the boy, his eyes filled with terror. "They hit me there," he whispered. Joaquín looked at him in the rearview mirror and knew he couldn't leave him. He made a decision he would never have dared consider before. He would take him with him, even though he didn't know for how long or what he would do afterward. He asked him if he wanted to stay in the truck for a few days, and the boy nodded without hesitation. The man in white said nothing. He just smiled. Joaquín didn't need his approval. Something inside him knew he was doing the right thing. The following days passed with a strange harmony inside the truck. The boy, whom Joaquín began to call Tico because of his small size, adapted quickly to the routine. He loved looking out the window, asking questions about the engine, the buttons on the dashboard, and listening to the stories Joaquín rarely shared with anyone. At night, he slept cuddling an old stuffed animal they found at a thrift store. Joaquín bought it without a second thought, along with a change of clothes and a blue cap. Every time Tico laughed, something stirred inside Joaquín's chest, something he thought had been dead for years. The man in white kept appearing and disappearing, but whenever he was needed, he was there. He never ate much, never slept much, but his presence felt like a silent compass, marking the way. One afternoon, as they stopped at a gas station, Joaquín noticed an older woman watching them from a bench. She had a deeply tired expression and red eyes, as if she'd been crying a lot. When she saw Tico, she covered her mouth with her hand. Joaquín thought she might recognize him, but she shook her head before he could ask. "It's not him, but he looks so similar," she said, and approached slowly. She told them that her grandson had disappeared 2 years ago, abducted by a man who later died in an accident without revealing where he had left him. Every time she saw a child alone, hope flickered and faded. Tico looked at her silently, then offered her the stuffed animal. She accepted it with tears in her eyes and hugged it as if it were a living memory. Joaquín felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't the lost grandson, but for an instant, something broken had healed. Sometimes you don't have to understand everything, just stop and look. If you feel the same, make it visible. Comment and subscribe. This channel only continues if you choose to walk with us. As they resumed their journey, Tico fell asleep in the seat, his head resting on Joaquín's arm. The truck moved slowly, as if respecting the fragility of that moment. Joaquín looked in the rearview mirror and saw again the man in white, sitting in the bunk, looking at the boy tenderly. "He's not your son, but he could be," he said softly. Joaquín didn't respond immediately. He gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I wasn't a good father. I lost the right to start over," he murmured. The man shook his head. "No one loses the right to love again." It was a simple phrase, but it hung in the air, like a lantern lit in a fog. Joaquín didn't think he deserved a second chance, but something inside him was beginning to open. Maybe because it wasn't just about him. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, someone needed him unconditionally. That night they parked in a clearing by a stream. They built a small fire, and Tico helped gather dry branches. While they heated some tortillas with cheese, the boy began to tell a story he had invented. It spoke of a magic truck that could take people where they most needed to go, even if they didn't know it. "The truck also heals the heart," he said, looking into the fire. Joaquín felt a chill. The man in white said nothing. He just watched. At that moment, footsteps were heard among the trees. A young man appeared limping with a torn backpack and dried blood on his forehead. He had been robbed while trying to cross into the United States through clandestine routes. He was dehydrated, hungry, and without hope. Joaquín helped him sit by the fire and offered him water. Tico passed him a tortilla without a word. And once again, as so many times before, the truck seemed to have arrived just in time. The young man's name was Matias. He was 26 years old and came from Tegucigalpa. He had lost his younger brother at the crossing, and his only goal was to find work to send money to his sick mother. Joaquín listened attentively as the fire sparked softly between them. He didn't question him, didn't offer advice. He was just present. Tico, with his natural empathy, sat beside him and held his hand fearlessly. Matias broke down. He cried silently for several minutes until he fell asleep on a blanket. That night, Joaquín couldn't sleep. He stared at the stars from the truck window, wondering why all this was happening to him, why every day someone new appeared, broken in some way, and he was driven to stop, to help. The man in white from the passenger seat whispered, "Because you said yes, and whoever says yes is never the same again." The next morning, Matias was taken to a parish that welcomed migrants. The priest who welcomed them knew Matias's story and offered him food, shelter, and help finding legal work. Before leaving, Matias hugged Joaquín tightly. "You're not just a truck driver, you're a bridge," he told him. Joaquín didn't know what to say, but inside, he felt something close to pride. The journey continued, with Tico singing made-up songs from the back seat and the landscape slowly changing from warm tones to more arid lands. At a small intersection near Camargo, they stopped to refuel. The man in white got out first and walked toward an elderly woman selling sweet breads from a makeshift table. Joaquín watched from afar as they spoke. The woman began to cry without anyone touching her. Then she looked up, saw Joaquín, and walked directly toward him. The woman, with white hair tied back in a bun and a face furrowed by age, stood in front of Joaquín with moist eyes. "My son died 6 years ago on this same highway, run over by a semi-truck. I never knew who did it. I could never forgive." Joaquín felt a tremor run through his body. He didn't know what to say or why she was speaking to him as if he had something to do with it. But before he could respond, the old woman took his hand tightly and added, "Today I understood that not all trucks bring death. Some bring comfort, and you bring peace." Then she handed him a bag of sweetbread and returned to her table, as if that conversation had healed a wound that had been open for too long. Joaquín looked at the man in white, who was now back in the truck, as if he had never moved. Tico was biting into a loaf of bread, unaware of what had just happened, but with a smile that lit up the cabin. Over the next few days, the journey became a chain of similar encounters. In every town, at every stop, something was waiting for him. Sometimes it was someone lost. Other times it was someone he'd given up looking for. A pregnant woman who needed to get to a clinic, an injured dog on the side of the road, a young man about to commit suicide on a bridge. Joaquín, without planning it, became a tool, a vehicle for something he couldn't explain. He was no longer just a driver, he was a witness, and although he didn't always see the man in white, he felt him close, in the silences, in the wind that blew through the window, in the decisions he made without thinking too much. The route was no longer measured in kilometers, but in lives touched. And although there were no maps or GPS to show the destination, Joaquín's heart knew he was heading towards something bigger than himself. One morning, while crossing a desert stretch near Villa Hidalgo, the truck began to malfunction. Joaquín felt the engine losing power and was forced to stop under the scorching sun. He got out to check the engine, sweating and frustrated, while Tico fanned himself with an old folder. There was no cell phone service, and the next town was several kilometers away. It was then that, out of nowhere, a young man appeared on a bicycle. He had tools hanging from a backpack and his face covered with a bandana. "Problems?" he asked with a friendly smile. Joaquín nodded without much hope. The young man got to work without asking for anything. In less than 20 minutes, he detected a problem with the fuel filter and found a temporary solution. When he finished, Joaquín wanted to pay him, but the young man refused. "I used to live on the streets. A truck driver helped me once. I'm just giving back." Then, without further ado, he said goodbye and continued pedaling through the desert dust. Joaquín climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and drove off as if nothing had happened. The man in white, who had remained silent, said something that remained etched in his mind. "Good is never lost. It just turns around." That phrase stayed with Joaquín for hours, while Tico slept with his head against the window, and the landscape passed by like an endless mural of earth and sky. Further ahead, near Durango, they saw a car stopped, with the hood open, and a woman sitting on the sidewalk, hugging her legs. Joaquín braked without hesitation. The woman didn't look up at first. She was crying. When she finally spoke, she said she had just lost her husband in an accident and didn't know how to continue. She wasn't asking for help with the car. She just needed to not be alone at that moment. Joaquín sat next to her without saying a word. Tico got out of the truck and offered her a melted popsicle he'd kept in his backpack. The woman smiled faintly, with the exhausted expression of someone who's cried too much. The man in white stood a few meters away, not intervening, as if respecting the intimacy of her grief. After a while, Joaquín asked her if she wanted a ride somewhere. She nodded. She said she had a sister in Zacatecas, but didn't know how to get there. Joaquín opened the truck door for her, helping her get in. "Thank you. Not for the ride, but for stopping." The words resonated with him. It was exactly what he'd done so many times on that trip. Stop, not out of obligation, but because he felt he had to, as if a silent voice were telling him when to slow down. And every time he did, something was healed. In Zacatecas, they left the woman at her sister's house, where she welcomed them with hugs and tears. Joaquín didn't get in. He preferred to wait in the truck with Tico, watching the two women embrace at the entrance. The man in white didn't get out either. He just watched. When they got back on the road, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was contemplation, a feeling of accomplishing something, even if they weren't sure what. Tico asked if they were going to continue helping people. Joaquín looked at him and said, "As long as the road demands it, yes." And the road, as if listening, presented itself with another unexpected intersection. An old man walking barefoot along the shoulder, dragging a torn bag, his gaze lost. Joaquín slowed down, and the man in white simply murmured, "This one is waiting for us too," was no longer a surprise. It was a mission. The old man's name was Don Laureano, and he had been a shoemaker in Aguascalientes. He said his shop closed years ago, and that after his wife's death, he began wandering aimlessly. "I wasn't looking for anything, but I didn't want to stay in the same place either," he said in a raspy voice as he drank the water Tico offered him. Joaquín invited him to get on the truck, and although he initially refused, he eventually accepted, with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. During the ride, they told him stories to make him laugh, and Tico asked if he could teach him how to make shoes. Don Laureano smiled for the first time. He said he had the plans for an old model in his memory, one he himself had designed for tired feet. He called them noble steps, he explained, looking at his own broken sandals. The man in white from the bunk nodded with his eyes closed, as if he remembered those same shoes. They arrived in Aguascalientes at dusk. Don Laureano asked to stop by his old workshop, even though he knew it no longer existed. Joaquín took him. The place was now a cell phone store, but the old man stood for a while in front of the window, as if seeing ghosts. Then, without saying anything, he took a rusty key from his pocket and placed it on a window frame. "In case someone ever remembers," he said. That night, they all slept in the truck, parked on a quiet street. Tico snored softly, Don Laureano talked in his sleep, and Joaquín dreamed again of his daughter Jimena, but this time it wasn't a distant dream. He saw her laughing, running through the trees, calling to him without reproach. When he woke up, he found the man in white sitting outside, looking at the sky. "Do you dream too?" Joaquín asked. The other man simply replied, "I see what you no longer remember dreaming." The next morning, Don Laureano decided to stay at a local nursing home he remembered from his youth. He said there were things one couldn't fix, but one could honor. Joaquín left him some money and promised that if he ever returned that way, he would visit him. "Bring me that kid so I can teach him how to sew souls," he said, smiling, while ruffling Tico's hair. The truck started moving again, and for the first time in days, the road seemed empty with no one waiting for them. Joaquín thought maybe that streak of encounters was over, but no. A few kilometers away, a woman was signaling on the side of the road. Her arm was in a cast, and a sign written in marker read, "Hitchhiking to Leon, urgent." Joaquín stopped without thinking. The woman got in with difficulty and explained that she had to be there in time to sign some custody papers for her daughter. The father wanted to take her far away and only had until 6 in the evening. The clock read 2. The GPS indicated 3 hours to Leon. They could make it if there were no setbacks. Joaquín stepped on the gas with more determination than ever. Tico handed the woman water and asked her questions that made her laugh through her tears. The man in white watched the road intently, as if counting the seconds. A few kilometers outside the city, a line of cars stopped due to an accident blocked the highway. The woman began to cry. "I'm not going to make it. I'm going to lose her." Joaquín got out of the truck, walked to the blockade, and spoke to an officer. Minutes later, a patrol car escorted them along an unfamiliar detour. They arrived at the office just in time. When the woman came out with the signed papers, she hugged Joaquín so tightly that his shirt was soaked. "You gave me back my daughter without even knowing her," he said. After leaving the woman, the atmosphere in the truck changed. Tico hummed a made-up song while biting into an apple, and Joaquín drove in silence but with a full heart. He felt that each encounter changed him, loosened him up inside, as if an invisible armor was slowly falling apart. Looking at the man in white, he realized he no longer needed to ask him who he was. That wasn't the important thing. The important thing was that he always appeared when he was most needed. Sometimes he spoke little, other times he didn't speak at all, but his mere presence was enough. Joaquín remembered his daughter Jimena more often now, not with guilt, but with a desire to see her again, to repair what had been broken. "Do you think she would forgive me?" he asked one night. The man in white replied without looking at him, "If you think you can love her again, then she's already started to do so." That night, they slept on the outskirts of an industrial park where Joaquín was supposed to deliver his original cargo. He had almost forgotten that this trip had begun as a simple transport of machinery to Durango. Everything they had experienced seemed like a detour, but deep down, it was the true path. After the delivery, Joaquín considered returning to Hermosillo. Tico, upon hearing him, became serious. What if there are people there too who need us to stop? The question lingered. As they headed back north, they came across a group of people walking along the shoulder of the road. They were migrants with torn backpacks, worn-out shoes, and children in their arms. They weren't asking for anything. They were just walking under the sun with the dignity of those who have already lost everything. Joaquín stopped the truck without hesitation. He got out and offered water, food, and shade. And for a moment, the truck became a refuge, a rolling oasis. As they handed out cookies and water, one of the women, pregnant and with bandaged feet, took Joaquín's hand. "I've never seen someone stop without us asking," she said, her tears tinged with dust. Tico offered her his seat and gave her his own blanket. The man in white helped an old man lie down on the truck's bunk bed and, as always, without judgment, without promises, was there. When they resumed their journey, they led the group to a church that welcomed walkers. No one asked where they came from or where they were going. They were simply welcomed as if simply being alive was reason enough. Before saying goodbye, a little girl clung to Joaquín's leg and said, "You have the gaze of those who see." He didn't know how to respond. He just stroked her hair, and that phrase stayed with him for many miles afterward. Passing through Torreón, Joaquín decided to detour to an old park where he used to take Jimena as a child. It was a place with rusty iron swings and graffitied benches, but it was intact in his memory. Tico ran down and threw himself down a slide with the joy of someone who doesn't need much to be happy. Joaquín watched from a bench, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees. The man in white sat down next to him. "And now?" Joaquín asked. "Now? You're going home," he replied. It was the first time that word, home, had real weight. It wasn't just a place. It was an emotional destination. And Joaquín knew that the trip in some way was bringing a new life to a close. Tico ran toward him, a wildflower in his hand. "For Jimena," he said. Joaquín tucked it into his pocket like someone cherishing a promise. The return to Hermosillo was silent, but not sad. Every kilometer seemed like a recap of everything they had experienced. The faces, the words, the hugs. Joaquín looked in the rearview mirror frequently, just to make sure Tico was still there, asleep, with his mouth half open, clutching his backpack like a treasure. When they arrived in the city, the sunset light tinged everything orange. The truck stopped in front of an old apartment building, the same one where Joaquín lived. No one was waiting, but there wasn't any need. He helped Tico out, carrying his small backpack. The man in white remained in the passenger seat. Joaquín looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "Is this all?" he asked. The man smiled. "It's just the beginning." Then, without saying goodbye, he got out of the truck and walked away, as if melting into the light. Joaquín went upstairs with Tico, who was asking if he'd have his own bed. "You'll have that and more," he replied. Upon entering the apartment, the dust greeted him with its familiar smell. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. He cleaned a little, boiled water, found a clean blanket, and set up a corner for the boy. That night, while Tico slept soundly, Joaquín sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, his heart beating. Differently, he took his cell phone and looked up Jimena's number. He hesitated. He took a deep breath and dialed. The call was brief, awkward, with long silences. But in the end she said, "Dad, can I see you tomorrow?" Joaquín closed his eyes and let a single tear fall down his cheek. He didn't respond with words. He just said, "I'll be here." And for the first time in a long time, that phrase had a weight he could hold. The next morning arrived with a clear sky and a gentle breeze. Joaquín woke up before Tico and watched him sleep, his face buried in the pillow and one foot dangling from the blanket. He made breakfast, eggs, toast, and chocolate milk. When Tico opened his eyes, he smiled as if he already felt at home. "Are we going anywhere today?" he asked. Joaquín crouched down in front of him and stroked his hair. "We're hosting someone very important today." Mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. It was Jimena. She was carrying a backpack, and her hair was shorter than the last time he'd seen her. Joaquín opened it with trembling hands. At first, they didn't say anything. They just looked at each other. Then she hugged him tightly, as if the years of distance compressed into that moment. "I didn't know if you'd come," he murmured. "Me neither, until I felt like I should." Jimena spent the day with them, playing with Tico, looking through old photos, and remembering childhood songs. She didn't ask too many questions about the boy, just watched him tenderly. Joaquín, deep down, knew the explanations would come later. That afternoon, the three of them went for a walk in the nearby plaza. They sat on a bench and watched the children run, the vendors sell cotton candy, the sun set behind the buildings. Joaquín couldn't stop staring at his daughter. She had grown so much, but she still had that sweet gaze that always disarmed him. In a moment of silence, Jimena took his hand. "I don't know what happened to you these years, but you're different." Joaquín looked at her and answered without thinking, "I stopped, and when you stop, you begin to see." She smiled, not fully understanding, but sensing that something real had blossomed between them. That night, with Jimena back home and Tico asleep, Joaquín went out onto the balcony with a blanket over his shoulders. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in months, but he just held it between his fingers. He looked at the city lights as if it were the first time he'd seen them calmly. He wondered where the man in white was. Was he still walking along other roads? Had he gotten on another bus? He didn't know, but he felt his presence, not as a figure, but as a seed that had remained inside him. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Jimena. "Thanks for coming back, Dad." Joaquín replied with one word: "Thanks for waiting for me." He closed his eyes and for a second thought the wind was carrying a soft voice saying, "You were never really gone." In the days that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Joaquín continued driving his truck, but it wasn't just for work anymore. He allowed himself detours, visits, brief encounters. He went to see Don Laureano every week, taught Tico how to change oil and read maps, and every Sunday he had lunch with Jimena. Not everything was perfect. There were days of tiredness, awkward silences, wounds that still ached, but there was truth, and that was enough. One afternoon, while cleaning the interior of the truck, he found a small piece of paper folded between the seats. It wasn't his. When he opened it, he read, "Thank you for believing in the impossible. Continue to be the hand that stops the truck, the soul that lights up the road. You are never alone." There was no signature, but Joaquín didn't need it. He knew exactly who it came from. He closed his eyes, pressed the note to his chest, and whispered, "I'll keep stopping too." One afternoon, Tico came running with a notebook in his hand. "I drew a picture of the truck. Do you want to see it?" Joaquín sat down on the couch, curious. On the page was a clumsy but clear drawing. The red truck, with a white-haired figure in the passenger seat, Joaquín at the wheel, and a row of people behind being helped. Above the truck, written in large, crooked letters, was the word, "Truck of Miracles." Joaquín felt his heart sink. He asked Tico why he had written that. The boy, quite naturally, replied, "Because whenever we stop, something good happens." That phrase was etched in his mind like an invisible tattoo. At that moment, he understood that his job had changed. He no longer just transported things, he transported stories, encounters, purposes. And although he didn't always know where he was going, he was clear about why he stopped. Days later, while passing along a lonely road toward Caborca, he saw a man waving with a canvas bag over his shoulder. He didn't wear a white robe or have a mystical gaze. He was just an ordinary man, but something inside. Joaquín pushed him to stop. He rolled down the window and asked if he needed help. "Just a chance," the stranger replied. Joaquín opened the door and offered him water. As they drove off again, the man offered his thanks in a low voice. Tico watched him curiously from the back seat. Joaquín didn't need his former companion to appear to know what he should do. The compass was now within him. He no longer waited for divine signs. He himself was the sign. The road continued, long and without promises, but every kilometer was a possibility, and with each stop, history continued to be written. One day, while checking his engine at a gas station in southern Sonora, Joaquín ran into an old colleague, Esteban, with whom he had lost contact years ago. Esteban, surprised to see him, asked if he was still in the transportation business. Joaquín nodded, but with a different smile. "I still drive, but now I carry other things." Esteban didn't fully understand, but invited him for a coffee. As they chatted, Joaquín shared some of his recent stories, not all of them, but enough. Esteban listened skeptically at first, but eventually looked at him with respect. "You've gone crazy, bro, but a good one." Before saying goodbye, he left him his number. "If you ever need help, call. I want to do something that matters too." Joaquín wrote it down, not promising anything, but gratefully. The seed continued to multiply. That same night, upon arriving at a small town where no one seemed in a hurry, Joaquín saw a group of young people organizing a collection to repair a rural school. Something prompted him to stop. He offered to transport the construction materials free of charge. The young people, suspicious at first, eventually accepted. Over the next few days, Joaquín and Tico worked with them, loading, unloading, and painting. Finally, when the children returned to school, one of them approached him and gave him a crayon drawing. A large figure wearing a cap, a red truck, and a smiling sun. Joaquín put it in the glove compartment next to Tico's first drawing. That night, as they gazed at the starry sky from the roof of the truck, Tico asked, "How many more people do you think we're going to help?" Joaquín replied, "I don't know, but as long as there's a road, there will be someone who needs it." Time passed, and with it, Joaquín's routine took on a new rhythm. He no longer measured his work by completed deliveries, but by encounters that left their mark. He had learned to recognize the signs he'd previously ignored: a lost glance on the side of the road, a makeshift sign, a mother silently hugging her son. Tico had become his official co-pilot, carrying a notebook where he wrote down the names of everyone they met and what they needed. "It's so we don't forget who we are," he said. Joaquín no longer questioned that child's wisdom. On the contrary, he relied on it. And when the road stretched on, faceless and storyless, they used that time to talk about life, about their dreams, about what hurt, and about what they still hoped to find. One day, while stopping at a gas station, Tico disappeared for a few minutes. Joaquín worriedly searched for him until he found him talking to a woman selling handicrafts in the parking lot. He had a deeply tired expression and a badly healed wound on his leg. "She says she can't continue selling because she can't walk properly anymore," Tico explained. Joaquín approached, bought several things, and then asked if she needed to go to the hospital. The woman hesitated but finally agreed. They took her to a nearby clinic where she received medical attention and, thanks to a social worker who heard about her case, was referred to an assistance program. As they said goodbye, the woman gave Tico a bracelet made of colorful thread. "So that you continue finding those no one sees." That phrase was engraved in Joaquín's heart, because that was what they were doing, seeing the invisible, stopping for the forgotten. It was near Guaymas when the past knocked on the door again. Joaquín was parked in front of a store when he heard a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Dad." He turned slowly, and there she was, Jimena, holding a little girl's hand, his granddaughter. Joaquín didn't know what to say. His heart pounded in his chest as if it were about to break. The little girl hid shyly behind her mother. "This is Clara," Jimena said. Joaquín bent down, smiled awkwardly, and extended his hand. Clara took it gently. "Are you the one in the red truck?" she asked. Joaquín laughed, holding back tears. "Yes, that one." They spent the day together, walking along the boardwalk, eating ice cream from a jug, taking photos. They didn't talk about recriminations. They just shared what they had now. Before leaving, Jimena told him that she wanted Clara to get to know her grandfather better. "But I want you to meet this one, the one now." That night, Joaquín couldn't sleep. He stared at the drawing of Tico, the thread bracelet, and the note he'd found weeks ago. He remembered the first day, the man in white, the tunic, the phrase, "Wherever you go, if you're willing to take me." He didn't know if he'd ever see him again. Maybe not. Maybe he was never there as a person, but as a response. But what he did know was that from that day on, he had become more than just a transporter. He was a witness, a channel, a response in motion. And although he wasn't looking for miracles, they kept appearing every time he braked, every time he opened the truck door. Tico, half asleep, murmured, "Do you think someone will ever do this for us?" Joaquín hugged him and whispered, "They already did, son. We're just returning the favor. Do you want more people to experience what you are feeling right now? So subscribe and share. That way, this miracle truck can keep moving forward." Weeks later, while crossing a mountainous area toward Nayarit, a heavy rain forced them to stop. The windshield was barely visible, and the road became dangerous. They took refuge in a small, abandoned roadside rest stop where an indigenous family had improvised a shelter with tarps and wood. They weren't asking for help, just trying to protect themselves from the icy wind. Joaquín got out with Tico and offered them blankets and bread. The father was reluctant at first, but then shook Joaquín's hand respectfully. "Few stop here, few see us." That phrase again touched something deep inside him. They shared the night, under that makeshift roof, listening to stories around a campfire and eating beans with handmade tortillas. As they left, one of the girls gave Joaquín a drawing, a truck with wings. "So that you never tire of flying," he wrote with a shaky pencil. As they returned to the road, Tico asked him why they kept finding people like that. Joaquín, still looking straight ahead, replied, "Because once you start seeing, you can't stop seeing." The boy remained silent, processing that truth. The rain stopped, but the air remained fresh and thick. It was on that same road that they saw a white cross by the side of the road with dried flowers and a spent candle. Tico asked who had died there. Joaquín stopped. They got out together and cleaned the place, replaced the flowers with new ones they had bought days before, and lit a candle. They didn't know who it was, but they dedicated a few minutes of silence to him. The man in white didn't appear, but Joaquín felt he was there, as if those simple gestures were part of the purpose. They weren't great miracles, they were small acts that together could change the world. If you're still reading, it's because something inside you is also moving. Don't ignore it. Subscribe to the channel and help more people stop too. Upon arriving at a village lost in the hills, Joaquín and Tico found a rural school where the children were studying in precarious conditions. Broken windows, worn blackboards, and desks patched with rusty nails. The principal, an energetic woman with her hair tied back and a firm voice, explained that they were receiving little support. Joaquín, without hesitation, offered his help. They used some of their own money to buy paint, wood, and school supplies. They spent a whole week there, working alongside the teachers and children. Tico taught the youngest children how to draw trucks and landscapes. Joaquín repaired benches and installed fans donated by trucker friends he met along the way. When they finished, the principal bid them farewell with tears in her eyes. "You didn't come just passing through. You came to stay in our history." That phrase remained engraved on the freshly painted walls and in Joaquín's heart. One night, back on the truck, Tico asked if they could continue doing this forever. Joaquín looked at him with serene tenderness. "As long as we have wheels, yes." It was then that Tico made an unexpected proposal. "What if we paint the truck? Let it no longer be just red. Let it be like all the people we helped." Joaquín smiled. Days later, in a paint shop, they began the transformation. The new design included clasped hands, intersecting paths, and faces of different ages and colors. On the side, in large letters, they wrote, "Wherever you go, if you are willing to stop." The truck was no longer just a vehicle. It was a moving message. And from that day on, whenever they passed through a city or town, people recognized them. Some came up just to say hello, others to tell their stories. And sometimes they simply wanted to say, "Thank you for stopping by." Do you want more people to experience what you are feeling right now? So subscribe and share. That way, this miracle truck can keep moving forward. One afternoon, while they were filling up their tank at a station in southern Sonora, a teenager approached with a notebook in his hand. "Are you the ones from the painted truck?" he asked. Joaquín nodded. The young man explained that he wrote stories about anonymous people for a school newspaper. He asked permission to ask them a few questions. Tico, excited, told several stories, while Joaquín remained more silent. Finally, the young man gave them a folded sheet of paper. "This is what you inspired me to write." Joaquín put it away without reading it at the time. That night, in a simple motel, he opened it. It was a short text that said, "Stopping is a revolutionary act. In a world that runs, breaking to help transforms. Thank you for reminding us that there is still light on the roads." Joaquín closed his eyes with the sheet of paper against his chest, feeling that everything he had experienced was summed up in those words. Over time, the truck became a local legend. Some called it the Helper's Truck, others simply the Miraculous One. But Joaquín wasn't looking for titles. He just kept driving. He didn't always find people. There wasn't always something to do. Sometimes the road was just that, a road, and he learned to value those moments too. The silence, the landscapes, Tico's laughter as he drew on the dashboard with an erasable marker. But every time he saw someone on the side of the road, he kept stopping. A pregnant woman who fainted from dehydration, a mechanic stranded with his motorcycle, a grandfather searching for his grandson with a crumpled photo. These weren't spectacular miracles, they were human acts, and each one left a mark on the truck, on Tico, and above all, on Joaquín. It was at a gas station near Magdalena de Quino that Joaquín saw a white robe again in the crowd. It wasn't possible. Months had passed. He tried to follow it among the vehicles, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He returned to the truck, his heart racing. Tico looked at him curiously. "Is everything okay?" Joaquín just nodded. That night, he didn't say much, but inside him, something was stirring. He dreamed of an endless highway, lit by headlights that didn't come from any vehicle. In the middle of the road, the man in white was waiting for him, smiling. "There's still more to do," he told him. When he woke up, Joaquín knew the journey would never quite end, because every person he met, every story he shared, was just part of a larger network that stretched across Mexico and beyond, a network of people willing to stop. Days later, while visiting a small town fair, a group of children surrounded the truck. They touched it as if it were magic. Tico got out and began telling them made-up stories that mixed reality with fantasy. Joaquín watched them from the driver's seat, his eyes moist. At one point, a woman approached with a notebook. "Can you sign this for my son? It says, you're his hero." Joaquín laughed awkwardly. He had never felt like a hero of anything, but he signed it. To Miguel, never stop stopping for others. When he got back into the truck, he looked in the rearview mirror and didn't see the tired man he'd been before. He saw someone transformed, and not by something divine that came down from heaven, but by everything he'd decided to do with his freedom. Stopping was his choice, and that choice had turned him into something else. One afternoon, stopping at a roadside cafe, Joaquín found a small wooden box forgotten on a bench. He cautiously opened it. Inside were old letters, black and white photos, and a handwritten note. "If you find this, please make sure my family's history isn't lost." Without thinking twice, Joaquín asked the owners if anyone had forgotten that box. No one knew anything, so he took it with him. That night, he and Tico looked through the photos together, piecing together a story of migration, hard work, and lost love. They decided to search for the descendants. It took weeks, but they succeeded. They gave the box to an elderly woman in Guanajuato, who, upon seeing it, fell to her knees in tears. "That box belonged to my father. I thought it was lost forever." Joaquín didn't want to stay long. He just hugged the woman and continued on his way. lighter, more whole. In every town where they stopped, someone recognized them, not by name, but by what they were doing. Sometimes they were greeted with applause, other times with silent hugs, and often with stories that began with, "I need to stop too, but I didn't know how." Joaquín understood that not everyone can stop a truck, but everyone can stop from within. Look at each other, ask questions, listen. Over time, messages began arriving on his phone from people who had seen the truck and wanted to do the same in their towns. "How do we start?" they asked. Joaquín always responded the same, "Open the door. The rest will come on its own." And so, without planning it, something bigger was born. A silent network of truck drivers, nurses, teachers, vendors, all willing to stop, to help, to change whatever was within their reach. Because they understood, like him, that miracles don't come from heaven. They are born in the heart. One morning, parked in front of a bakery on the outskirts of Los Mochis, a little girl timidly approached with a folded letter. She didn't say much, but she handed him the paper and ran off. Joaquín calmly opened it. The letter read, "Thank you for making my mom smile again. Since you guys passed by, she doesn't cry as much." There was no signature, just a drawing of a truck with hearts coming out of the exhaust. Joaquín put that letter away with the others. He already had a box full of memories, testimonies, papers that no one else would understand, but which for him were proof that something real had happened. Not movie miracles, miracles of flesh and blood, small, discreet, sometimes invisible, but profound. And with each new day, with each kilometer, he felt that his mission wasn't to understand, but to move forward, with his eyes wide open, and his heart too. Shortly before marking a year since he picked up the man in white on that dusty road, Joaquín decided to return to that place. He didn't know what he expected to find. Maybe he just needed to close a loop. He came to the same rusty sign, the same landscape, the same curve. He stopped. He got out of the truck and walked a few meters, with Tico following him silently. No one was there, only wind, sun, and the distant echo of a memory. He sat on a rock and took a note from his pocket, the first one he had found in the truck. He read it softly. "Thank you for believing in the impossible." Tico asked him if everything they had experienced had been real. Joaquín looked him in the eyes. "What do you believe?" The boy smiled. "I think so, because we carry it inside." And in that moment, Joaquín understood that he no longer needed proof. He was the proof. That night they slept in the truck, under a clear sky full of stars. Joaquín wrote in his notebook, a habit he had recently adopted, a few words he didn't want to forget. The journey was never about arriving. It was always about stopping. The next morning, they set off on a new course. There was no longer a load waiting, no clear destination. But that didn't matter. The important thing was to pay attention to the people, to the signs, to the opportunity to do something, no matter how small. Tico had become a wise co-pilot, and Joaquín was no longer the solitary man who only wanted to keep to a schedule. Now he was part of something bigger, a mission without a uniform, without a salary, but with meaning. And that kept him alive, alert, with a willing heart. Every day was a chance to transform a story, even if it only lasted 5 minutes on the side of a road. In a small town in northern Sinaloa, an elderly woman stopped them, waving a handkerchief. She asked for help carrying medicine to her bedridden husband. Joaquín agreed without hesitation. Upon arriving at the house, a humble adobe room, he met Don Nacho, a former teacher with Alzheimer's. Tico sat down to read aloud to him while Joaquín helped with the bottles. The woman thanked them with freshly made tortillas and a long hug. Before leaving, she handed them a note written by her husband during his lucid days. Sometimes, help doesn't come in the form of medicine, but rather companionship. That phrase lingered in Joaquín's head the entire way home, because he understood, now more than ever, that stopping wasn't wasting time. It was conquering indifference, and every story they touched them too. It transformed them without warning. Already in the final stretch of that transformative year, Joaquín decided to write Jimena a letter. Not a letter to send, but to tell her everything he hadn't said with words. He told her about Tico, the people they had met, the man in white, and how it all began with a simple gesture, breaking. He wrote that he didn't feel like a hero or enlightened, but that he had learned to look, to stay when everyone else passed him by, to give the little he had with all his heart. He put the letter in his notebook and went for a walk. On a corner, a young man was trying unsuccessfully to push a car. Joaquín approached and, without saying anything, helped him. When they finished, the young man said, "Thank you for stopping." Joaquín smiled. "That's what I always try to do." He returned to the truck, looked at Tico sleeping with a book on his chest, and knew that everything, absolutely everything, had been worth it. Months later, one random night as he climbed into the truck for another mapless trip, Joaquín found a white feather on the passenger seat. No one else was there. There was no wind, no open doors, just the feather perfectly positioned. He took it between his fingers, turned it carefully, and smiled. He didn't need to understand. He just put it away with the letters, drawings, and notes he collected. Then he started the engine, looked in the mirror, and said to Tico, "Ready?" The boy nodded sleepily, without even asking where they were going, because they both knew that the destination didn't matter. The path mattered, and what you choose to do when you see it. Joaquín put it in first gear, rolled down the window, and let the night air caress his face. And as the truck pulled away along the dark road, its red taillight seemed to tell the world, "Someone passed here and decided to stop. You made it to the end." And if this story left something in you, we sincerely ask you to subscribe to the channel. It's the only way we can continue telling stories that matter.